This is the Essential Podcast from S&P Global. My name is Nathan Hunt. With 2025 rapidly approaching as we move into the holiday season, we want to take some time to reflect on the year that was and give additional airtime to some of our beloved guests. Once again, it is time for our end-of-year clip show. Way back in January, we had the pleasure of speaking with Mary Childs regarding her book, The Bond King, and by association, the story of Bill Gross, which for those unfamiliar is one of the most intriguing rise and fall stories in the world of finance. Here is a preview of his story in a clip from our interview with Mary. Your book is a story of a rise and a fall, right? This huge figure. What was Bill able to accomplish in the bond market, and how big was his success at the height of it, right? So leaving aside the fall, let's talk about the rise. How big? How good?
Well, it's nice because there was actually a study that came out that looked at his performance, because everyone's always like, I think he was just lucky. He just benefited from falling interest rates over, however many years of his career, decades and decades. And that's true that he did benefit from a falling interest rate environment for the duration, basically, of his career. It's also true that so did everyone else. So I always find that, just intellectually, there's something missing in that argument. But sure, okay, let's say that there was going to be someone in that he's fungible, that it could have been anybody. I don't think that's true. I think there are a lot of kind of anecdotal reasons as to why he was better and why he was able to do what he did. In part, that's size. In part, that's the way he conducted himself in the industry, and the kind of aggression that he was willing to demonstrate, and the comfort with gray area he was very willing to do, that a lot of other people just start backing away slowly. I was very heartened by this study that came out, right? I think it came out, the first draft maybe was 2019, something like that, by a former PIMCO guy and a quant. And they just looked at, okay, did Bill Gross actually do well over his career? Actually. And they found that there were these robust, replicable, basically factors that he took advantage of. And that makes sense to me. Those were the things that he always talked about as, quote, structural alpha. And they were just his approaches to scraping a little bit extra basis point out of the market here and there, literally all the time over decades. And that helps you if you make a big dumb call on treasuries, which, happens to all of us. You still have this kind of cushion to fall back on. So I think having that kind of, it's a bit of a barbell approach, really. I don't think he would call it that, because I think he filled in the in-between, but having that kind of backstop and those guardrails of I can't totally blow this up because I'm still, scraping those extra basis points out. I think that really, to me, that's compelling. And I think that's what the authors of the study found as well.
The next clip is from our interview with Brett Christophers, where we discussed his book, The Price is Wrong, and the role that the price of energy plays in the implementation of the future use of renewables. So I want to caution our listeners, it is going to be impossible for me to touch on every aspect of Brett's book. This is an incredibly detailed look at energy markets and how they actually function in the real world. So necessarily we're going to be doing a bit of a top level overview today, but let's go back in time a bit and talk about price. How did price come to be seen as the single decisive factor in the adoption of renewables?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would say that there were probably three reasons for that. So one you've already touched on in your introduction when you were talking about the fact that this was kind of a stick that the right, and by which I mean the political right, and in particular those within the political right that were, and in many respects still are, staunch opponents of decarbonisation. This was a stick that they kind of beat the renewables train with. They would look at the relative costs of generating electricity from solar and wind versus from coal or natural gas, the two main fossil fuels today used for electricity generation. And they said, look, it's so much more expensive. We shouldn't be doing it for that reason. And that kind of that political argument really put price in the forefront. And it's remained in the forefront in part because that was where it was put. But I think there's deeper reasons for that as well, which I talk about in the book. I think the second one is that if you look at how historians have written about previous energy transitions, previous episodes of societies shifting from one method or constellation of energy types to another, of which the most important and I guess relevant example is the shift to fossil fuels in the first place, which occurred, I guess, first on a significant scale in England in the early part of the Industrial Revolution, where within the cotton industry, there was this shift from water to steam plus coal. Historians have generally understood that through the prism of price. So they've basically argued that energy transitions can only occur in any kind of full fashion once the price of the new challenger technology is cheaper than the incumbent, essentially. So insofar as that's how we have typically understood previous transitions, rightly or wrongly, that's not surprisingly how we've been thinking about the current transition, learning from history, in other words. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing, and I think also very, very important, and I think this will be familiar to probably lots of listeners, is the fact that price is the kind of lens through which environmental problems in their totality have increasingly come to be understood over the last 30 or 40 years. And so without wanting to kind of re-educate people who already know this, it's just in summary, the basic argument there is that environmental problems in general and climate change in particular can be understood as quote unquote market failure problems. So the basic idea is the reason we're destroying the planet is that we are not properly pricing what you might call the environmental costs of things like burning coal or burning natural gas. In other words, we kind of price them at zero, and therefore we're over consuming the resources from which they are obviously, in fact, extracting a cost. And the answer there would be, as long as we begin to cost those things, as long as we put the right price on those environmental disbenefits or environmental costs, then markets will kind of do the job of enabling a shift away from those destructive activities. And so insofar as that's how we've increasingly come to understand all environmental problems, really since the 1980s, it's not surprising that that's how we've come to think about climate change and the challenges of the energy transition. So you have all those three things, and I think they're all very, very relevant.
Back in July, we had the privilege of sitting down with J. Doyne Farmer, where he explained some of his findings when writing the book, Making Sense of Chaos, A Better Economics for a Better World. In this next clip, Doyne elaborates on the idea of equilibrium in economics. Let's talk about another foundational myth of economics, which is sort of an idea of, let's call it balance, that there's this idea that an economy governed the right way, or perhaps left to its own devices, attains a kind of equilibrium. Even if economic balance is perhaps an unattainable myth, would you call it a beneficial myth or a harmful myth?
Well, in some cases it's appropriate, in other places it isn't. Equilibrium in economics is actually a slippery term because it can mean simply that supply equals demand, or it can mean a kind of strategic equilibrium where you figured everything out and I've figured everything out, and we settle into a mode of interaction that reflects that. And so it's always important to ask which of those two is being used. Now, there are situations where assuming that supply equals demand is a pretty good assumption. In stock markets, probably over, say, a month, it's probably not a bad assumption that supply and demand more or less average out. In housing markets, it's a terrible assumption. Housing markets, you can have persistent imbalances for years where there are, for example, more buyers than sellers or vice versa. So it's very context dependent. Similarly, if we think about it in the strategic sense, then there are some situations like tic-tac-toe, where I mentioned, we both figure out how to play the game. We play the Nash equilibrium. it's a pretty good description of behavior. But there are other games, as we've shown and I describe in my book, where games that are complicated and competitive, like playing the stock market, to go back to Mandelbrot, where we've shown that the typical behavior does not settle into an equilibrium, a strategic equilibrium. It oscillates through time. There are, fads where one thing happens, fads where another thing happens. Behavior can be chaotic and complex.
With all the news around AI this year, it was almost impossible for us not to devote some time to the topic. That is why we had friend of the show and host of the S&P Global AI Insights podcast, Sudeep Kesh, come on the podcast to help me help myself in trying to overcome my AI skepticism. What you just said is interesting to me because it actually goes against what I would expect AI to do, right? I would expect AI to be fundamentally reductionistic. And let me explain why I would think that, right? So if you think about human intelligence, right? We are sort of pattern recognizing organisms, right? And the classic example that is given over and over again is it's the person in the jungle and they hear rustling in the leaves and they think that rustling is a saber-toothed tiger. And even if they're wrong 9 times out of 10, being right that one time is an evolutionary advantage. So we evolved to recognize patterns, even patterns that did not actually exist. So then we develop this technology which recognizes patterns, right? I mean, fundamentally. That's what AI does, is it sort of recognizes these patterns. And then we train it on these large language models, which are the output of human beings recognizing patterns. So we've got pattern recognition 3 deep, and pattern recognition is already sort of a flaw in human thinking. I mean, pattern recognition is where conspiracy theories come from. So how is it that we recognize patterns, use tech to recognize patterns, train it on attempts to recognize patterns, and yet we end up escaping from those patterns? I'm just confused.
Yeah, it depends on the level of sort of objectivity you're talking about, because language, you could say, has lots of sort of cultural inference and things like that. The example that comes to mind is, to say somebody's modest in Chinese, right? It's mama hu hu. What that means is neither tiger nor horse. And that means basically you're modest, you're not a tiger, you're not a horse. So there's these kinds of sort of idiomatic expressions. I use this just because it's a default example that comes to head. There's an inherent lack of clarity that is present in the language and the expressions that we use them. So it's to say that the language, and this is, true of sort of all LLMs, you have this sort of proxy for the objectivity extrapolating information from that thought, from that sentence, from that sound, and so on. Whereas a lot of things where you're basically, it's still pattern recognition. It's just patterns that you're not able to kind of observe because you don't see the correlation between these exogenous events and each other. And because of its objectivity, it is recognizing patterns. I think where some of the things escape, and this is true of visual arts, like what is the meaning of this particular painting? Like that means that there's an expression of what the artist intended. There's the expression in you in seeing the painting. There's an expression in what's your particular relationship to art or the specific imagery or your own sort of experience in your life. Like there's a lot that goes into it that wouldn't be measured, and then subsequently you just reduce, you're trying to extrapolate signal from something that's just, there's so much noise in the ability to identify, 1 + 1 = 2 for this particular thing. It's just like there's lots of variables that AI is not really considering unless you have this, telemetric instrumentation or some kind of instrumentation to be able to see it. And then it could start to find the patterns because it's identifying what are those variables. So instead of, I think that the fundamental issue with AI is really one of human instrumentation. What are you enabling it to see signal of? And I think this is one of those things that, like, if it saw everything, and there's plenty of reasons why you don't want it to see everything, because like you would have tremendous vulnerability and all this other stuff. This is where Skynet comes from. Like there's lots of good reasons why to sort of think about this stuff. If it had access to a lot of that more information, then it would be able to see more things and perhaps be more helpful. Now, it also then has an increasing likelihood of being weaponized and so on. So it's just like, again, there's lots of good reasons not to. And once I think that the nature of information and all these things are once the information's out there, you can't really take it back. So it's like kind of a one way. So to err on the side of prudent governance, you almost want to restrict it, which means you're not going to have sort of the best benefits. I feel like I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, but it's I think that's nature of, again, it's kind of an expectation, but also what are the instruments that you and data that you're enabling as part of that decision making framework to find the patterns, and what do you want it to do? And in some cases, we may be blaming the technology when we are in fact the thing that's restricting it.
Additionally, this was an Olympic year. This year's Olympics was all the more notable for being the first games with full gender parity in athletic participation. To discuss this and the history of female athletes, we had author Maggie Mertens join the podcast to discuss her excellent book, Better, Faster, Farther. Another sort of important story that you develop in more detail than I've ever read it before is sort of the history of women in the marathon, right? The marathon is full of myth anyway, right? The idea of the marathon race is actually based on a myth and actually a misunderstanding of a myth. But the idea that women were incapable of running the marathon, even after they ran marathons, right? So you have these wonderful stories of women sort of hiding in the bushes as this woman hiding in the bushes as the Boston Marathon starts and jumping out and running the whole thing and finishing, and that somehow not being evidence that a woman could run a marathon, and just how long that was fought for. And to me, the story there is really about the organization that runs the Boston Marathon. It's about the IOC. It is organizations refusing to confront reality.
Yeah.
What is it about organizations like the IOC that makes them unable to just acknowledge that a group of women just ran a marathon and we could do that at the Olympics? What is it? What is that conflict?
Well, so Bobby Gibb was the first woman to unofficially run the Boston Marathon. That happened in 1966. I will point out that the first woman to join the IOC did not happen until 1981. And so, so we had pretty much an entirely male sporting organization. And I think that has to do with a lot of it. Even in the 80s, we had like 75 to 80% male athletes in the Olympics. It was just a very male institution. And that progress happened so slowly, right? And again, it was one of those things of, we'll give the women this much, but we're not going to. It was often framed as taking away opportunities for men if we're going to add events for women, right? Because the charter also has this very strange thing in terms of like limiting the number of athletes that can participate in the Olympics. And so it's always kind of a give and take game. And yeah, I mean, even going into those 1984 Olympics, so they actually ended up voting the marathon in 1981. And they also did not have a 5,000 meter race yet. They did not have a 10,000 meter race yet. This was the first year that they were running the 1,500, I think. And so that it was just a very, very slow progress. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that these men were running these sporting institutions as institutions for men. And, giving women opportunities was still seen as kind of this little consolation prize, if you will. And okay, well, maybe, we see it even today, right? Even in the past, you mentioned in your intro about, broadcast deals and things like that. And these numbers have changed drastically just in the last 3-4 years. And so it's really, I think, an example of institutions will not change until they're forced to, right? And even in the last 5-10 years, there have been, economists saying, there is money being left on the table here in terms of women's sports. And these institutions are too, I guess, tied to old ideas and traditional ideas about, what's important and what will make money and what people want to see. It just takes a hand being forced. And, I think the story of the women's marathon and the Olympics is so important because these women really came together and did it for themselves, right? Like they organized like crazy. Catherine Switzer and Jacqueline Hansen and all of these women who came together and started their own organizations, started their own marathons, and literally went to every member of these voting committees to sway them. Went to doctors, went to sports scientists and said, fine, we'll do these studies so that we can prove we're not, going to die or have any ill effects by running these races, even though, yes, the proof is already there. We've already been running them. But they really pushed and pushed and pushed until they could not be denied. And I think that you're seeing a similar thing happen in women's basketball and things like that, where these women are doing it for themselves, right? They're making their own social media presences be super valuable so that people can see, okay, there is value in this game.
And last, but certainly not least, we were very thankful to be joined by Andy Critchlow, a friend of the show and a person capable of breaking down the state of oil markets and how they operate. Help me understand, because this is one of just my fundamental areas of confusion. The OPEC plus countries, as they cut production, the U.S. increased production. And so they're losing market share. So they're losing, in a sense, some of their influence over oil markets and oil prices. Why continue? Why continue with the cuts? Why not look into a different strategy? What am I missing that they are seeing?
So the key driver to this is Saudi Arabia. And fundamentally, Saudi Arabia is driven by the economics of producing crude in Saudi compared to everywhere else in the world, which means that it can afford to suffer lower prices because it has lower production costs. Producing crude onshore in Saudi, they're gigantic fields. They have the Ghawar field, the world's largest onshore oil field, makes up the vast majority of their production. It's very cost effective. It's $1, $4 a barrel, depending on who you speak to produce oil in Saudi Arabia. Their fiscal break even is somewhat higher because it's a high spend economy. They're developing, gigantic real estate projects, NEOM, huge amounts of investment. They need an oil price to balance the books in Saudi Arabia, in theory, around $80, $85 a barrel, maybe a little bit higher. But they have huge reserves, sovereign wealth funds, investment assets, and so forth. So they can weather the storm. And ultimately, they have these low production costs. So they can basically afford to buy market share, buy themselves into markets if things really get tough. The same's not really the case in the US. And again, you've got to remember that so much US crude, the majority of US oil products, crude, it's consumed within the US. World's largest economy, still world's largest consumer of hydrocarbons. It's kind of very close with China now, but still the world's largest. So it has this huge domestic market on its doorstep. But because the industry in the US is structured differently, because it's funded by shareholders, publicly listed companies, the profit and loss has a much bigger impact. So US production is very sensitive to weaker oil prices, and that's when we had the big crash in oil prices a few years ago. Then it really started to hit the Permian. It really started to hit West Texas. And, that's because, as well, a lot of that drilling was levered. It was debt financed. And then when you get financing costs going up, that's a problem, right? And that gets us to the next side of this story, which is kind of all the M&A that you're starting to see in the US. But the Saudis don't have that problem. The UAE, they don't have that problem. The problem that they have is this fiscal break-even issues, that they have these high-spend economies. They are heavily dependent on oil exports. They're heavily dependent on hydrocarbons, despite all these huge investments, despite the great efforts over the last 30, 40 years to diversify their economy. Saudi Arabia is still 60% dependent on crude exports for its foreign currency earnings. All of these countries that we're talking about, they peg their currencies to the US dollar. If you take that peg away, then their currencies are just proxy for a rising and falling oil price, so incredibly volatile. So the US has this advantage in that game.
And that is that. Another year in the books for the Essential Podcast. Once again, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, our listeners, for participating in these conversations with us and allowing us to be part of your lives. We appreciate all the time you share with us, and we can't wait to provide you with more insight, conversations, and entertainment in 2025. The Essential Podcast is produced by Patrick Moroney. At S&P Global, we accelerate progress in the world by providing intelligence that is essential for companies, governments, and individuals to make decisions with conviction. From the majestic heights of 55 Water Street in Manhattan, I am Nathan Hunt. Thank you for listening.